Let's see here. The GOP basically stands for nothing. They always have. They basically haven't had any good ideas in the last 40 years. The Republicans in Congress basically are blocking a bipartisan investigation into the January 6th insurrection, but their spines are being crushed by years of obedience to the former squatter Donald Trump. But the members of GOP have once again retreated from civic responsibility, and with one more humiliation of those last few in the party who thought that the Senate Republicans might mimic something like a statesmanship. However, this effort is more than the usual cynical mendacity and crass careerism, or as one might say, at least Stefanik, that characterized the current Republican Party. This latest insult to the rule of law and the Constitution was possible only because the Republicans have already lost confidence, basically, in their own principles, because they don't really have any principles. The GOP now stands for nothing. They always have. The party of Lincoln has become, in every way, a political and moral novelty. The American conservatism, which once meant something that was definite and tangible, and it says you could fight those beliefs and policies, but you could also argue with them, admire them, or hate them, but they fucking existed. Strom Thurmond, Ronald Reagan, Howard Baker, and Edward Brooke were not necessarily deep thinkers, and they didn't all agree on everything anyway, but the GOP held clear lines of thought that stood as alternatives to the Democrats basically anyway. Most of those ideas were predicated on some basic beliefs about human beings themselves, including the conviction that human nature is fixed rather than malleable, or whatever you call it. That intellect is a better guide to action than emotion, but that tradition is valuable, and that religious faith is basically a cornerstone for a healthy society. On policy too, the conservatives moved along the broad but common lines, and they believe that incrementalism is better than sudden change, and that America is exceptional, that patriotism is honorable, which most likely it isn't anymore, and perhaps most important, that government is a necessity to be controlled rather than be a teacher, rather than a teacher to be revered. These principles gave the Republican Party several decades of an almost preternatural self-confidence in the eventual triumph of their ideals. After all, if human nature is eternal and rationality is unassailable, then emotional schemes and government overreach that deny these realities are bound to fail. America is exceptional, and therefore America can do what its citizens believe they can do, especially if they treat government as an instrument rather than a master. This confidence once attracted young voters back in the 70s to the party, and the country then seemed to be falling apart then, faced with riots, political assassinations, bombings overseas and at home. David Frum has called the 70s strange, feverish. He referred to the 70s as a strange and feverish year, and a time of unease and despair that was punctuated by disaster throughout. The Columbia University professor Mark Lilla would later write about how difficult it is to convey to anyone who wasn't alive and politically aware at the time what a dreary place America seemed to be in the late 70s and how lacking in direction and confidence it was. The Republicans stepped forward in 1980 as optimistic warriors, which they really weren't, joined by some disaffected Democrats, and they were certain that they had the intellectual and moral strength to claim victory over domestic chaos and foreign challenges. Reagan and the resurgent Republicans felt the narrative of an America in decline after years of stagflation, urban decay, and rampant Soviet aggression. The Cold War was still raging back then, and the Republican solutions, including the laissez-faire, economics at home, and not sure if I said that right either. Economics at home and a confrontational foreign policy abroad were born from an ideological conviction that led a prominent Democrat, Senator Daniel Moynihan of New York, to basically warn his colleagues in 1981 that the GOP has become the party of ideas, which technically they weren't. The self-assurance of the Republicans who emerged from the post-Watergate wilderness might seem impossible to comprehend now that the modern GOP is rife with what they call know-nothings and apocalyptic hysterics. but their confidence in their own ideals was unassailable and indeed often to an unhealthy degree. Now all of that is fucking gone. Today's Republicans exist only to stay in power, and not least so that their elected officials can avoid what they dread most, being sent home to live among the constituents. The conservative writer George Will is right that the Republican Party in 2021 has become something new in American history, a political party defined by the terror that it feels for its own voters. The Republican legislators should be fucking scared. Their base is angry that is an angry white minority that cares nothing about government, and its members want their elected officials to rule by hook or by crook. The Constitution and democracy itself be fucking damned, and they don't want any grub about namby-pamby ideals or policies. They want the elections controlled, the institutions captured, and the Democrats owned. The rest to them is just nothing but fucking noise. The survival instinct, basically, and that this white minority rage has triggered its craven Republican policies. Has triggered in craven Republican politicians. Basically, is how the GOP mutated from a party championing around individual liberty into a movement pushing monstrosity, status authoritarianism. It is how the party of limited government began agitating for government truth ministries. It is how the party of exuberant free marketers became a cabal of crony capitalists and knee-jerk protectionists. It is how the party that once fought the Kremlin expansion provided top cover for Russian intelligence attacks against the U.S. institutions, anyway. The Republicans have tried to argue that if they are not in power, the Democrats and their ultra-democratic allies will destroy our system of the government and create a majoritarian nightmare. We must stay in power, and they mule, so that democracy itself will survive long enough to outlive the encroaching authoritarianism of the Democrats. Technically, we don't want the Republicans in power, and neither the Democrats I can care less about too. So, who cares? These defenses are risible nonsense in the wake of Trump's constitutional mayhem and the GOP's descent into a conspiratorial lunacy. But even on their own terms, the Republican excuses are a little more than lightly veiled defenses of minority rule. The GOP long ago abandoned any effort to convince the women and the people of color, immigrants and others that the party had a place for them, and instead the Republicans in Congress have surrendered to the ignorance and racism of their most extreme voters in exchange for a continued life of privilege inside the comforting embrace of the Capitol Beltway. But the Republicans face an investigation into an insurrection provoked by their own leader have armored up and gone into armadillo mode, and they will protect their own rather than the nation and the Constitution that they swore to defend. And this behavior should serve as a warning. A party that doesn't believe in anything ends up believing in only its right to rule, and a movement that believes only in its own power is a deadly enemy of constitutional democracy. Yeah.